Hajime!
What is Rome? What is Rome? For Nietzsche, obviously, every country has a people, right? The nation, right? That's what a country is. It's not a place, it's not a piece of land, it's the nation. So, what constitutes a nation? Well, necessarily, it's the overriding constitutional spirit, right? So, for us, we have this misnomer or misconception of what a constitution is. We think it's a piece of paper. No. A constitution is a spirit. So, for instance, for Nietzsche, it was this idea that the Greeks were Greek, and what defined a Greek is the animation or the ambition to excel all others. That is what made a Greek really tremble. And ambition. And everything was motivated by the will to be seen and venerated as preeminent, the best. For a Persian, it was to shoot straight and to tell the truth, right? So, to aim and perceive the world. So that's a very coy way of saying, basically, to penetrate the world and to understand it as it is, and to find your mark, right? So, that is what constitutes a Persian. And of course, over time, as these ideas are given flesh, they're given history, they're giving understanding, there comes, of course, the sedentary and aesthetic qualities which revolve around that central node of quote-unquote ideology. But it's deeper than ideology, it's deeper than philosophy, it's this thing which is most basal to the human, right? It is it is just like, it's something that is almost as a fish to water. It's something that you can't perceive within oneself. Well, not really, unless you're just someone that's truly peering through time and you're just a really smart fish. But there is no sense as far as what is the Roman. No one has really made a pronunciation of what the Roman is. There are a lot of aesthetic qualities which are ascribed to the Roman. Oh, Rome is about the pillars. Rome is about the forum. Rome is about Cicero and law and truth, or rather, rhetoric. Rome is about Caesar. Rome is about the legions. Rome is about civilization. Rome is about X, Y, or Z, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's all a lie. All of these things are aesthetics. They're incidental, right? They're things that we've accumulated and ascribed to Rome. But if Rome were to be born today, of course its aesthetic quality would be slightly different. Or rather, what we would think it'd be totally different. Spengler talks about this, right? So, for instance, we make misconstruals of historical parallels because we confuse superficiality and superficial forms for the more deep trends, the true substructure, the true quote-unquote esoteric deep fundaments of a theory or a trend. And so, if you're able to understand this, Rome isn't an aesthetic. Rome isn't the legions. Rome isn't the Senate House or the Forum, or any way that these individuals organized their will to power, right? It isn't those things. Okay? So, and this is also something that conservatives, especially, are the worst ones, the worst offenders about this, because they confuse what is incidental for what is essential, right? There is an essential nature to things, and the essential nature of something can have various manifestations. So, for instance, think of a boat, right? A boat can be a canoe. A boat can be, a little sailboat. A boat could be a submarine. Literally, it's called a submarine. Yeah, the submarines are called boats in the Navy. A boat can be many things. It can be made of steel or wood. It can go under or over water. But there are essential qualities which we understand it to be a boat. Would that not be so? So, this is what I'm trying to explain to you guys. There is essence, and then there's incidental. Forget the superficial forms, and learn to understand what is the essential character of something, to understand it in and of itself. Rome, I would posit, is the will to domination. Will to domination. Right? So in the beginning, remember that in the Aeneid, it was about laying low all those proud nations and bringing peace, quote unquote, to the world. This was important, or a way of saying, for instance, that it's not peace per se that the Romans brought. It is rather the manifestation of Roman life and power and the will to power in its image. And it is that they call peace. The best way to explain the concept of peace in the Romans' view is how the Muslims see the Ummah and the realm of war, right? Literally, it's called the realm of peace and the realm of war. And that everything which was in synchronicity with Allah is seen as the realm of peace. And everything that is in conflict with or destroying of that spirit, that religion, their will to power, is war, the realm of war. And the Romans felt this way too, right? And so there are two mechanisms, right? So it's to dominate, right? This idea of domination can be seen manifestly in a number of different manifestations. Because, of course, it ported into itself many different cultural innovations. For instance, the gladius is a Hispanic design, right? The cuirass and the ring armor is from Gaul. A lot of its philosophy, especially Stoicism, which was brought into Rome, was brought by actually Cicero, and it was a Greek invention. A lot of, for instance, monotheism and Christianity itself is a foreign import. And, I guess what I'm trying to explain to people is, I'm trying to show that Rome isn't those things which it brought into itself. Rome is the impulse that synthesized and brought in these disparate factors and wove it into its tapestry. Because Rome isn't like the Greeks, who built their entire life basically around the agonal principle. The principle of basically competition and demonstration of one's excellence, of one's preeminence, right? The idea that one is the best. The Romans, of course, they had that, but to a lesser extent. The idea for Romans, the ideal for Romans, wasn't necessarily to prove one's excellence per se in the sense of equal competition, but to be master, to be a god, to lift a finger and see armies rise up from the ground, to be virile, for instance, for a Roman man, especially in Latin culture, to have many women or in your circle, to be a great seducer. That is virile, right? To be in touch with the gods and commode with them, or whatever it may be, and to even ascend to become one. These are the things of domination, the ability to exert one's will, whatever pretense or personal, ambitions or aesthetic qualities one wants to port onto the world and see it manifest. That is Roman. And of course, I mean, there can be a lot of counterexamples. When I'm speaking to you, you have to obviously try to understand in good faith, and you have to understand in a way that is inductive as opposed to deductive. So, of course, you could probably ascribe this central theme to many different peoples across time and in the world, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that is what the animating principle of life is, the will to power, right? As Nietzsche explains. But obviously, the way aesthetically these things are expressed, or the emphases in which they become, or the direction and so on and so forth, these things are what differentiates between like and like. Because of course the Sassanids, which is of course the Persians, they had a will to power. They had a pretense for universal empire as well. However, that wasn't their central thesis. What brought them catharsis as a nation was that truth, to be harborers and messengers and understanders of life and truth. For instance, and this is why Zoroastrianism has such a strong, almost like a kind of mask-off situation, revealing the Persian to himself, which is, it's a religion based on the idea that it's the conflict between day and night, the conflict between light and truth, and night and darkness and lies and deception. It is deceived. It betrays itself by what it makes religious, by what it makes the highest and divine ideal. Okay, so in our era, we make a delineation between religion and ideology. Okay, but religion and ideology are both types of spiritualism, right? They're both types of spiritualism. Okay. And the best way to explain liberalism as such is as a spiritual way of life. A spiritual way of life of the bourgeoisie, right? It is the fetishization of money, right? And coziness. It really is, okay? So it can just be distilled down to that. Or communism as resentment of and world revolution. Basically destruction of the bourgeois or whatever, and Christianity and so on and so forth. But what I'm trying to explain to you is that spirituality is real, and just because you and I have been brought up to understand religion from either a partisan perspective, so either you're understanding your religion or you're understanding it as a basically crystallized and sclerotic, dead, spiritually dead form of something that still permeates. So for instance, Christianity is dead, right? But people think that the worship of its edifice, you have to go to a specific place and do these arbitrary things and observe these arbitrary laws, that it necessarily makes you this spirituality which undergirded that institution which it came today. So, I mean, for instance, and this is why Rome ceased to be Rome once it became Christian. Even though it permanessed, its shell permanessed, its state function permanessed for a long time, it died spiritually because it generatively could not reproduce itself. It only could basically sustain and slowly decay, and the character and culture of Rome became something quite else. Okay? So there are essential natures to things, and that essential nature is what we describe as spirituality. It is what we describe, or what comes down to us in the form of misnomers like ideology, philosophy, and religion. Okay? So spirituality is important. And because ultimately the way you understand the natural world is to understand that it is divine. There is no secular part of the world. It is simply everything is a religious experience. Life is a spiritual event. And I think that people really don't come to understand these things because they believe there's a delineation. And let me tell you, my friends, there is no delineation. Do you know why I know that? Because as much as for instance, in America, we have the separation of church and state, okay? Well, at the end of the day, remember that the religious ideology, whatever, the religious or spiritual structure of the United States, of what the United States of America claims to be, penetrates all facets of life. In your church, for instance. So, for instance, the Catholic Church, when they have American bishops and cardinals come, it's seen as a deleterious effect because they're incredibly heretical, and the vision that they have of the world is warped by the essential quality of their upbringing and their Americanness, because their American spirituality warps and out strengthens that of Christ. And you see that this often and commonly. So I think it's really important for you to grasp this basic fundament, legionaries, because ultimately, when you start to understand that life has essential qualities, and then of course there are incidental hangers-on, or basically like a hermit crab and its shell. Or actually, that's not right. How about a snail and its shell? A snail can lose its shell, right? But ultimately, the shell stays. It stays for hundreds of thousands of years, but the shell can't be remade. Only the snail can make new shells, okay? And so, once you come to understand this generative thing, you are then able to understand the consequence, right? So, if we're able to understand what made Rome, you'll be able to understand, of course, what is Rome, right? So, what made Rome wasn't the columns. What made Rome wasn't Cicero. It sure as hell wasn't the law. It definitely wasn't Christianity. It most certainly wasn't a number of different things which we ascribe to it. Rome was Romulus. Rather, Rome was what Romulus was mythologized to have done. Rome started its inception by appealing to basically outcasts, murderers, criminals of all kinds, and formulating them into a tribe, to basically warriors. And remember, for me, criminality is not the same as what some Christian would think a criminal is, right? Or some whatever. A criminal generally is perceived to be someone that is like mean and cretinous or whatever, cretinous and whatever, and that, you know, murder is bad and blah blah blah. I don't believe any of that stuff. What a criminal actually is, the essential nature of a criminal, is fundamentally someone of strong egotistical will. Someone who doesn't care for the law and who is their own law. A man of power, right? So someone who is willing to destroy or overcome the petty laws and bullshit obedience that slaves give, and so they become what is called a criminal. This is important because what he did is synthesize these men and gave them a polity in which they would ultimately become the law. Their will and the law were one and the same. This is essential. And then remember that the way that they formed their first generation and consecrated this idea of who Rome is was the rape of the Sabines. Fundamentally abducting women and raping them and then having kids with them. To take the world, the wealth and the generative nature of, I guess, Mother Nature, and taking it into your command and making it your own is not simply symbolic, but it is also essential as well. It takes a warrior to be able to seduce the natural world into generating your will into it. You can't get anywhere if you are a peon, okay? Every revolution or establishment of something new or beautiful has always been done so by a great crime. remember that Prometheus stole the fire of the gods and gave it to man and suffered for it, but he is a hero despite being a criminal. And he was a criminal and relished in his punishment because he became his own law, his own realm. He basically is the primordial deity of all Indo-European peoples, the Promethean man. He is the reason why we are able to go out and reach into space and time and conquer all. So it is once you understand these things and synthesize the essence by the birth, what generated Rome in the first place, then everything else falls into place. You start to understand that Rome isn't about civilization, okay? Rome is about the caprice of these lords who have the strength to rule and to see it beautiful and made it in its own image. It is the elevation of man to the state of a god and to make it his own, okay? To make the world his own. That is what Rome is. And it is begotten by the manly virtue, or Andrea in the terms of the Greek, by discipline, by the concepts of war, right? The devotion of conflict. Life isn't about right or wrong. Life is about who won and who lost, okay? And what you consider to be right or wrong is the legislation of the great man, the man who created the great thing, okay? And so the way that you get to those positions is through war, is through sabotage, deception, destruction, extirpation, and slavery, murder, rape, all those kinds of things. All the things that you say are the lebed are in fact the mechanisms by which greatness and great civilization happen, right? So I think it's really important to read this quote from Nietzsche. Hold on one second. And here it is. 1 second. So it is here, reading Nietzsche now. What belongs to greatness? Who will attain anything great if he does not possess the strength and the will to inflict great suffering? Being able to suffer is the least thing. Weak women and even slaves often attain mastery in that, but not to perish of inner distress and uncertainty. When one inflicts great suffering and hears the cry of his suffering, that is great. That is what belongs to greatness. Okay, this is the happy science. So remember, there is nothing laudable about suffering. Any pathetic loser can suffer. Any pathetic loser can overcome self-suffering. It's only the great who are able to look upon the suffering of others, to which one has authored, and look upon them with indiscretion, or rather, indifference. The Romans used to enslave the masses and used to crucify people by the thousands and hear their cries and screams and see their families beg at their feet to make it happen. But Rome was able to maintain itself precisely because it was able to look upon their tears with disdain, not pity, disdain and contempt. Because the difference, and this is why Christianity is so sick, is because Christianity makes a god out of the slave who died on a cross. Christianity makes a god out of weakness. It makes a god out of suffering. It divinates saviordom. The Romans were gods, okay? So it's the difference between a god complex and a savior complex. There's nothing more contemptible than pity. There is no room for pity, and that is why Rome was completely ascended. It was completely different. Do you understand how different that is? And what's more is that there is this psychologizing or pathologization of what is called psychopathy and sociopathy, which of course are what Nietzsche is basically describing here. And you realize that a lot of these personality types strongly overlap with the warrior archetype, right? And you notice that the more warrior that archetype is, so for instance, special forces, for instance, they are overrepresented in these types. And the more slave-like, the more peasant-like, the more docile someone is, the more, especially liberal, how rare those things become. Of course, at the extreme fringe, that's different, but they are what is called criminals, and I'd rather a criminal than a hobbit dweller, right? Greatness always comes from great pain. Obviously, you suffer great pains, the pain of discipline, self-discipline, discipline of others, but the willful imposition of pain, suffering, extirpation, subjugation of others to your will. Now let us peer back into the mists of history, because a lot of you have a lot of kind of strange understandings of what the dynamic civilizationally is going on for us, and what to do, and how is it that things can be turned around, can it be turned around, etc., etc., okay? Therefore, it's important to examine the past, especially because it's the case that we're examining Rome. Rome as an archetype is one of these wondrous empires that manages to captivate our imaginations for generations, right? It's been roughly, I don't know, more than 1,500 years since Rome itself fell, and then, less than, 600, 700 years since Constantinople, the last redoubt of Roman control, fell as well. And it calls to mind, what is it that Rome was? For many of you, images of pillars and marble-clad cities and perfectly pressed togas of senators sitting and debating in the Senate House, and a bustling economy with a forum, and kind of like this, Rome from the British Broadcast Commission or the BBC. They had this really great TV show called Rome, right? And it portrays Rome in the late Republican era, kind of devoid of filth and devoid of many of the aspects, but it also shows Rome at one of its pinnacles, one of its economic pinnacles, one of its great climaxes of power, which it would only in some circumstances again reach and exceed, right? And this was principally how Rome was throughout the Principate. So what is the Principate? The Principate is the time from the first emperor, Augustus, all the way through to roughly the 5 good emperors. So the end being, of course, that of Commodus, and this ends around the era of 180 AD, right? And then, of course, we come into the era of the crisis of the 3rd century. And I'm well aware that 100 AD is the 2nd century. I'm talking about the 3rd century now. We fast forward a little bit. But what is it like? How different is it? And I want you to be able to cast out of your mind's eye any thought of a bustling economy and patriotic citizens with very robust elites, in good faith debating and winning office for the glory of Rome. No, my friend. This was a time where, of course, a lot of the luster still remained in the Roman Empire. A lot of the great marbled city of Rome still remained. Many of the cities that studded the Mediterranean existed, of course. But it was a very different beast, right? This was a time when people, generally speaking, were not Roman. They did not feel Roman in the sense that they were Roman ethnically. They were Roman citizens. They were often people that spoke a sort of vulgar Roman, dialects obviously varying from Gaul to Spain. And if you're in the East, they spoke a type of Greek, right? So it was a Hellenic part of the Roman Empire. And that was the dominant language of expressing oneself. But it was an empire that varied in its ethnic components, but lost its core ethnos, right? Its core Roman ethnos, and even more so in Italy. This was a time when Italians themselves and Latins themselves, Romans themselves, recused themselves of public service and patriotism because they were basically resting on their laurels. They wanted their slaves to be doing all the work. They wanted foreigners and barbarians and auxiliaries to do all their fighting. They wanted their generals and their senators and so on and so forth to do all their governing. What they expected was bread and circuses, right? They wanted just simply the easy life, the hobbit life. They wanted to live in the suburbs, kind of like us Americans, be pathetic and weak, and they wanted to never embrace adversity. They wanted to be weak, okay? So this is the difference. And as time goes on, you'll start to see, of course, the Roman professional army under Augustus was very different from the professional army of the 3rd century. Not to mention the composition, right? So during the Augustan imperial legions, my friend, these were professionals. They were fully volunteer force that were willing to serve the glory of Rome, not only because they were patriotic, but because there was good pay and because there was a surplus of men who wanted to serve. And as time goes on, military service becomes less, let's say, popular. It becomes so unpopular that the majority of the levies come from abroad. It comes to the point where conscription, which previously was only levied on very certain circumstances, when there was the state was under existential crisis, it was the case that they would sometimes do some measured levy conscriptions, but now it became almost a matter of course, a matter of fact. So much so that there were increased legislation initiatives which punished fathers and individuals for cutting off the thumbs of their sons and their cousins and their clients. So that way they would be rendered, not usable by the state for legionary service, so for soldier service, like cowards, like effeminate little cowards. They decided to use the coward's way out. And you'd see this, for instance, in World War I, where a man would stick his hand above the parapet so that way a sniper could shoot a hole through it. And so that way they could avoid the inevitable death of the front line. You see, there's this old term, a coward's mother never weeps. And so no Roman mother wept too profusely during the wars of the empire. No. No, the Romans had become cowards after centuries, and it was up to the men on the marginal periphery of Rome to carry forth the ethos of what Rome had become. And so in steps Diocletian. Diocletian, the man, right? He is actually from a part in modern-day Serbia, which back then was Illyria. Now, it's important for you to understand how it is the pattern of the Romans settling and setting up colonies, especially veteran colonies in the hinterlands of the Roman Empire, right? So, at first, Roman legionaries would be settled in Gaul, and then later Spain, and then further later in Pannonia, right, and Illyria, which is where, in modern day, if you can imagine it, is Austria, Hungary, Croatia, basically the former Yugoslavia. They would basically have their children there, and then so on and so forth, in very important places. Now, this is significant, right? Because what you're doing is genetically selecting for the strongest men to reproduce over generations on the hinterlands of your empire, right? That's so important, okay? That's so important because what ends up happening is that you select out of the Latin culture the soldier, right? You basically take your strongest seed and you put it elsewhere. And maybe this is why, or maybe this is the secret to France's modern success. Maybe this is the secret to the reason why the Serbs and many of the actual primordial Vlach people, right? That's what they're called, Vlach. It's a very strange name. Why they're so strong. I think it's because they're descendants of actually the legionaries that had been settled there. But I digress. The point being is that it is actually Diocletian, who is the grandson of a slave, the son of a freedman, a very marginal figure indeed, who is only, let's say, his virtue, which allowed him to be inducted into the Roman Legion, was his physical robustness. He was a strong and tall man. I think his Greek name, which he had come to the Legion with, was Diocles, right? Which is very strange. But anyway, bear with me here. There's a legend, of course, that actually Diocles' mother had been inseminated by Mars in the form of a snake, and she had given birth to this semi-divine figure. I believe it, by the way, 100%. His mom got power fucked, and so too did this power fuck of a man come into being, Diocletian. And the story of his career through the Roman legion is awesome nonetheless too. He, from humble origins, from humble legionary, learns how to read, how to swim, how to fight, how to become athletically proud and strong, how to be a great leader, and slowly but surely ascends in rank until finally, of course, he becomes from legionary to optio, from optio to centurion, from centurion to a very shocking legate, which is very difficult to achieve, and then, of course, from legate to proconsular general, and then finally, of course, in the bid for Numerian, I believe, who wanted to become the emperor, he double-crossed him, killed all his adversaries, and then finally became emperor himself. A great rags-to-riches story of a man who was born to be great, but started from humble origins, and this is Diocletian, right? And so Diocletian's time inherited three major problems, huge problems. First, the economy was tanking. There was a runaway inflation, right? And inflation for their time was different from the inflation of ours, okay? Currency back then wasn't straightforward. Currency came in the form of specie, and specie in itself, so gold, bronze, silver, they had intrinsic value and artistic value as opposed to being a type of fiat currency, which is to say what we have. There is no inherent value in the paper currency that we have or the credits that we have, which are internet, right? No. It's almost like the value of a coin was itself a piece of art that was valued at a quote-unquote standardized level. So it's a kind of halfway house between modern currency and archaic forms of barter and economy, right? So this is very difficult because it also wasn't a rationalized system. It wasn't like today where there's 100 pennies is $1, or whatever nickels is $1. No. It was really weird. It was something like 1,250 obols, so brass obols, turned into a sestertii. I think it was like 2,500 sestertii turned into a denarius, and so on and so forth, until you finally got a talent of silver or gold. And a lot of these things, it was basically bullion. And this is important because before there were modern price controls, before there were like any of these kinds of things, the economy would float, and it would also come in tides, right? It would be very disparate types of economic balance, right? So there would be high water marks and low water marks, and especially if there were acute pressures, there was nothing stopping bread makers, for instance, from hiking up their prices, being next to people, so gouging prices. Things that we take for granted here in the modern United States of America, regulations and price controls and stuff like that to prevent rapacity amongst the merchant class, because you know how the merchant is, right? In general, the shopkeeper is always there to try and gouge your eyes out, because he's a spiteful little crumb of a human being, right? And so what they want to do is they want to get as much money out of you as possible, okay? And so what would end up happening is that in the ancient times there was nothing to guard against this, and it was Diocletian himself who instituted the first rudimentary price controls. First, he re-leavened the actual currency. So, for instance, the silver sestertii was releavened into its purity, so a lot of people would dilute the physical coin so that way it become less and less silver as time went on. He actually made sure that the coin was worth what it was worth. He created smaller denominations of coin as well, and he gave price limits. So he made this massive compendium of common goods, and which he would effectively rule unto death, or rather, he would give a death sentence out if anyone were to price or sell goods above a certain threshold. If one were to do this, what would end up happening is basically, you know, it was his attempt to regulate the market, to keep people from being so rapacious and petty, right? To make sure that prices were within the average Roman's ability to pay, and so that way Roman soldiers were able to go about the empire and engage in commerce with the local merchants, and so that way there was this salutary, beneficial circle of, how do you say, virtue that was established, right? So Roman soldiers would be paid a salary. Those salaries would be spent on local markets. Local markets wouldn't mark up stuff, and so they would basically exchange their services for currency, and so the market would actually function well, right? And obviously, like everything rudimentary and novel and new, it ran into a lot of issues. It ran into a lot of problems. And so one of those problems, of course, economically, is that simply it just didn't work, right? There were things that simply human beings didn't want to sell for that amount of money, especially because there was no limit to the standard of living or how much it would cost for someone's existence in the Roman Empire, right? So basically, it would be more expensive to live in Greece than it would live in some hinterland in Pannonia, let's say, right? And so it just didn't work. Therefore, Diocletian did a second most important thing, which is the remilitarization of the Roman society as a whole, from the top all the way down. He had so much contempt for civilian life. This is why I love this guy, by the way, that he said, okay, no problem. What we're going to do is standardize what the provinces are becoming. So he broke down the Roman regions into bigger and more manageable chunks that made more sense economically and militarily. And basically, he forbade any civilian from internally migrating within the empire so as to stabilize the economic base of which these people were created, and therefore he would be able to assess the value and production of each basically parcel of land with its family and so on, each city, so that way he could standardize taxes, not over leverage these taxes, so not do the tax farming thing, which is a problem, and instead of insisting on these people pay in kind, they paid by barter. In currency they paid in kind. So they paid by, okay, so this family creates so many rawhides. This family creates, this goldsmith can make so much stuff. Okay, you know what? We're going to leverage his skills to fix the Aquila and the eagles and so on, and a certain portion of his year would be utilized in labor for this. Or if people had a nondescript ability, basically they would be used in corvée labor, so that way a week or 2 weeks out of the entire year they would be used in public work projects. For instance, retrenching trenches, re-emptying, or making fields basically hospitable, so either clearing them of trees, rocks, or draining them of swamp water, or fixing fences, fixing and mending walls, creating roads, etc. You get the idea, right? So basically the idea is that he did not let anyone get off the track of serving Rome. He made sure even the smallest guy was doing his part and he wasn't skating. Nothing was allowed like that, okay? Later, I think it's important to also kind of focus on something that really goes by the wayside, but really he doubles down on Rome's religious foundation. So during that time, religion started to become more organized. It became more of an ideology, if you may. And the way that ideology is leveraged is not simply the justification, right, of one's self, but it's also the justification and the foundation for a larger polity. It's the foundation for a nation, right? That's what a nation really is. It's the infleshed form of religious ideals. And so there were like a number of different religious slash ideological tendrils that were making its way into Roman society, namely Mithraism, then of course Manichaeism and Zoroastrianism, which is of course interchangeable to a certain degree. Obviously, don't freaking stake me, okay? I'm using this interchangeably, but the important dynamic for you to understand is that Zoroastrianism is the kind of ideological slash religious tenet of the Persian Empire, where the Shah himself was the ultimate incarnation of the divine right ruler to the one monotheistic... Dude, they're attacking my throat, okay? This bastard's commies coming through my throat. Anyway, monotheistic religion. And so what it was seen and it acted as is that the acolytes of Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism were fundamentally proxies of Persians within Roman territories. So not only were they askew from the Roman overall culture, they were also in the thrall of Persian, I don't know how you'd say, the Persian overall ethos, right? Because only the Persian king was the arbiter of God on earth, right? So obviously there are some political implications, but there's also the spiritual ones. Now, here comes the tragedy, right? So Diocletian sees the problems on the horizon. He understands what Rome stands for. He very much is a Roman, not simply in name, but in spirit. He believes in the gods. He believes in the ethos of Rome to dominate and to order the world in its image. And unfortunately for him, these myriad tendrils had started to infest and infect Rome. Diocletian was exceptionally successful when he extirpated the Manichaean threat. He crucified the main leaders, killed anyone who wouldn't reconvert, and exiled anyone else, and deprogrammed the rest. Further, he was able to also turn back the tide and wage a Persian war, which, of course, was on the political aspect rather a stalemate. But the most important thing is he was able to reassert Roman power. Yes, Russian. No, Roman power, and to reaffirm the kind of deterrence in which he was placing upon the Shah. Now his attention turned to quite another threat: Christianity. Christianity, for 300 years, had slowly asphyxiated the Roman spirit, wrapping its vines around its neck and choking it out. And so, Diocletian, our hero, goes down into Roman civilization and roots them out. So he crucifies the main adherents, extirpates anyone who refuses to convert, exiles anyone else who is too minor, and reprograms or deprograms those individuals who were sold poisonous lies in their ears. However, unfortunately, like cancer, it was too late. No matter how much he set out to destroy the Christians, by that time it had infected every facet of society with the exception of the Roman military, which is, of course, the only and last place that Romanism actually existed, and it finally died. Why? Well, it died for a number of reasons, and the most important one is because the civilian populace refused to actually affirm the Roman spirit. They had become too weak, too decadent, and in the Nietzschean sense. I don't mean like the moral sense that you're used to, which is just about wealth and stuff. It's like, no. These people had become weak, and they had reveled in their softness and their willingness to, I guess, flounder in all the plunder and peace and lack of suffering and anesthetization of their civilization, right? So basically, as I told you before, the Romans had started to outsource everything: hard labor to foreigners, fighting to foreigners, governors and governing elites to a very remote elite, very few. And so what happened was, without this cognitive tensile strength, just as I mentioned it before, the Romans over time atrophied their ability to effuse that Romanness. And ultimately, no matter what Diocletian did by that time, which is build temples, tear down the churches, expel the Christians from teaching in schools, whatever it may be, ultimately, even if he cleared the vines away and all the sickness and all the cancer, the Roman gods, or rather the Roman people, died. They died 200 years prior, and they died due to their vice, due to their softness, and their unwillingness to be cruel, their unwillingness to see how the sausage is made, right? And that's the thing that we are facing today, right? So in bourgeois suburban society, we like all the amenities of civilization, but we don't like how it's made, right? We can always morally posture about this or that, but we love those diamonds, but we don't like it when it comes from the hands of some poor African child. We like the smart technological phones, but the minerals are also begotten by the same hands, and basically slave labor. With the cheap consumer goods, same thing. And similarly, this existed in Rome, right? So these people became soft as a people. And so the Roman gods withered away, and they replaced them with the slave god, because these people were slaves to their passions, slaves to their effeteness and their softness, to their weakness, and they deified that, right? So even if it were the case that on the blink of an eye they were able to wash away Christianity, at the end of the day they had become fundamentally what Christianity is, which is basically decadence. And decadence in the sense of the Nietzschean sense, right? They became basically soft, weak, unwilling, like literally without will to power, willingness to nothingness instead of willingness to domination, which is the Roman raison d'etre, right? And I know this sounds schizo, and I don't mean to be rude, but I think it's important for you to understand how it is that you don't simply outwardly impose this spirituality. It is something inwardly kindled. Okay? And so, what does Diocletian offer us moderns, a teaching? Well, first of all, it teaches what we can do. We can interdict the influences or the insidious influences from abroad, but we can also understand the shortcomings of a very heavy top-down approach. It's that understanding that it's the very hardship and cognitive tension which gives rise to strong wills. It is hardship that gives rise to a strong will, not softness and peace and effeteness and turning the other cheek and all this weakness. Okay? And Diocletian, look, I'm not here to talk about necessarily everything about Diocletian, right? Because he is a storied man. He's a great man. He's the reason why the Roman Empire lasted for as long as it did. But Rome itself, in its heart, died. And not because of him, but because of the people. They had become soft. And what I fear the most for those of you is that you were born soft. You were born with excess of wealth. You were born without the stomach to see how the sausage is made. And this is what our transmission is about. Me and Sergeant Barnes are here to show you, shove your face into the beauty of reality. The gore and the violence and the peace, that is nature. Nature is both. And when you deny one half of it, the other side withers as well. And this is why Rome, by the way, it withered on the vine. It took another, 1100 years to finally succumb to its sickness, but it never again expanded in the way that Diocletian was able to reestablish it. And so, my parting message for you, legionary, is fundamentally to examine times in history, and I highly recommend Edward Gibbon's account of Diocletian from this time. And I would highly recommend researching about the Tetrarchy and etc. And in a future episode, I'll go into the battles and the campaigns and all the cool stuff. But I think the most salient part for us is to understand how it is in history we can run into these roadblocks. And that fundamentally, what a nation is a soul writ large, or rather an orchestra of souls. And the only way to make strong souls is by inspiring it and kindling it in yourself. And the way that one can possibly, as a leader, impose it upon your followers or your nation or whatever, is by making these people basically go into the wilderness, experience hardship, and overcome it. Be as unforgiving and unrelenting as nature. For those you can't inspire to do those things on their own will, we must throw the 80 percentile of people, like the 80% of people who are unwilling to expose themselves to danger and suffering and toil and the harsh reality of life. We have to throw them into it. And until then, we can't raise that new Rome that we're trying to build. I think I'm getting a little bit too hammered. Me and Sergeant Barnes have decided to stay back, kick back, relax with a pina colada, some nice chicks, and I'll see you next time on the transmission of Bruta Historia. Out.